That said, education from its root in the Greek, I think, Greek and Latin, means to pull out of somebody something that already exists inside of them, or to withdraw or to bring forth out of somebody. It doesn't mean to put something in, right? And so we don't need to be taught how to think or taught what to think. We need to be encouraged to think, to come to our own conclusions.
Welcome to today's episode of the Jeff Heilman Project. Today we're going to talk all about entrepreneurship, education, those things that we do outside those 12, 16, 20-hour work days that we seem to all have. What are we going to do with that spare time? How are we going to grow our businesses? But getting straight out of the chute, I'm going to come right at it, and I'm going to ask Mr. Heilman, my husband, I'm going to ask you, Jeff, I would like you to tell me about the worst keynote speech you've ever been to. Why was it the worst? Not one that you might have done, because I know that you have some that you're not necessarily proud of, maybe, but like actually one that you went to and you're like, wow, this is bad. Or some other public speaking engagement or something where you're just, I could do better than this.
I'm trying to think.
You don't need to throw anybody under a bus.
I'm not throwing anybody under the bus. I'm trying to think. I mean, there's some guys on social that do ads that I'm not huge fans of, which will remain nameless.
Okay.
There's just some people that just
What is it that as a consumer of content, which you are, especially in the area of entrepreneurship and keynote speeches, like what is it that irks you? What is it that sets you off?
I think it's people that are there's a peak performance state in any type of professional athletics or when you're in business. All one of the most important quotes that I ever had is probably the best answer for this, which is that in How I Raised Myself from Failure to Success by Frank Betcher, he talks about contained enthusiasm, and that contained enthusiasm is what closes deals. So if you have the Tasmanian, the ShamWow,
we love Mr. ShamWow, but
and that, I'm sure he sold some shams, right? But it's contained enthusiasm. It's like on a motorcycle, if you're all the way down to first gear and then up one gets you to neutral and then like up one more gets you to second gear. That's the posture. That's where you have to be through meditation and through rehearsal for your pre-shot routine in professional athletics. It's how you get to the white moment in professional sports, whether you're playing basketball or something that's quick twitch muscle tissue. When you're closing deals, that's where you want to be when you're closing is it's all the way down, up one to neutral, and then one level of enthusiasm and excitement above that. And anything higher than that, and I think it can rub people the wrong way.
Well, I know in the concept of if you want to talk about feng shui, if you want to talk about organization or even home decor or makeup, there's a level that you want to put on, and then if it gets to be too much, there's this editing process. I know that that's
Sure.
like the number one thing is like, what can we edit? It's the
That's right.
politest way of saying, let's remove some layers because there's a lot,
That's
you
right.
got a lot going on right now.
And I have a friend of mine, Carlos Collado. I'll give him a shout out. He's a regular
Hey,
viewer
Carlos.
and good buddy of mine. He's been good enough to comment on some of the podcasts on YouTube as well. And he did a TED Talk. And I was so proud of him for doing TED or TEDx. I'm not sure which, but it was a regional one, but it was in New York. And he performed and did a TED Talk. You can look it up. It's great. It's about following your intuition. And it was super polished. Of course, it was edited because TED does a great job of editing, but you still have to have the content there.
Mm-hmm.
And so his enthusiasm and his preparation, every line, every nuanced dramatic pause, everything was rehearsed, scheduled, structured, practiced, drilled down and disciplined. And so I think the biggest thing from the work that I've done studying professional paid keynote speeches, which is not the same as being asked to talk at a Kiwanis Club or
Toastmasters,
speak at Toastmasters or anything like that. We're talking about a professional paid speech where they're cutting you a check for $5 or $10 or $15 or $20,000 to come and deliver some deliverable in a conference, which is part of their budget for professional speakers to come. A couple of things to note about those. Number one, keynote speakers do not send their slide deck in advance for approval, right?
Right.
Keynote speakers are picked up in a black Mercedes at 68 degrees Fahrenheit
Okay,
at the
that's an
airport.
elf reference right there. If nobody knows.
They are treated with a totally different level of respect. Malcolm Gladwell does not have to send his deck in
No.
advance to see if it meets the approval. And so what we see is that their content is trusted. They come from an already a position of strength. They already have credibility. They are the keynote speaker. I mean, they're your invited guest. And I haven't seen a lot of those really go sideways.
And I think that that's a perfect segue to what we're talking about on this episode, because what I hear you saying is how you carry yourselves, how you see yourself, and how we see ourselves is going to be most determined by what content we're putting in, what propaganda we're choosing, if you want to call it propaganda, what education, the level of ongoing education that we subscribe to in that extracurricular time and that extracurricular activity. I remember growing up thinking like the really successful men and women in our generation were the ones that were doing the crossword puzzles at, in the morning when they first woke up. I can remember any time we would spend the night at my grandma's house in Cupertino that I would come out at, I thought was early, what probably was, 7 a.m. or something like that. But my granddad and my grandma were already up. It had been probably 5 a.m. that they had been up. They were already sitting at the table. They were already into the Wall Street Journal and drinking their coffee. There was a time in history where ongoing education or continuing to grow yourself, to read autobiographies, to do these kinds of things was the normal way that you would spend time in your evenings when you weren't at your job. And so I think what we're seeing this shift to, 1-second sound bites or 2-second videos. And it seems to be that it's number one, robbing attention span, and number two, taking away that, let's be honest, we have the answers to everything via Google search we can have that in 10 seconds flat, and we don't even have to read an entire article. We can just read the headlines. So how would you encourage those that are listening today or on your checklist out of your 9 daily disciplines? What are some of the boxes that you check? Do you have like a must read 30 minutes every day or must read a certain amount of books per year? Like, do you have something in your checklist that's built up for education that you could share?
Well, I do. And one of them is keynote speeches. So in the world that I live in, which is technology sales, where I've been for 20 years, you'll find phrases, words, common themes. Like, for example, AI. AI and ChatGPT are everywhere now. I got a phone call earlier today from a guy selling a very well-branded, and if I mention the name of the organization, a lot of people here would know the organization. I got a call this afternoon, or actually this morning, from a guy who was pitching, did a great job of it too, a go-to-market training system for the incorporation of ChatGPT and AI into online marketers, anybody in business or in sales. And it's part of the nomenclature now. So one of the things that we need to do in business is we need to stay current with the vocabulary of the leaders in our space. And so one of the things that I've done, and this may seem a little ridiculous, but it's helped me from a vocabulary word perspective, is I would pick the top 20 or the top 40 companies each year that I felt were the most respected. And I would pick the CEOs of those companies as the key communicator, the tip of the spear for the organization and what they were providing as their value. And then would put together a list of effectively 20 to 40 keynote speeches, and I would go and take notes on the vocabulary words that they used and would put notches into the number of times that they used that vocabulary word in there. And it got a little cumbersome because once you get to 20, 30, 40 keynote speeches, you can't really do hour, hour and a half, 2 hours times 40, each quarter, which is what I was trying to do, was to get the top 20 keynotes. But what I found is that you can pull in about the first 6 or 8 minutes, you'll pull 90% of the headline of what that keynote speech is going to be about. And you can even go to the end and they'll summarize it. So you can actually cut a keynote speech, let's say a 90-minute keynote speech from an executive. You can cut that down to 6 or 8 minutes, and then you can watch it on 2x speed, which I'll do that. I'm making a lot of quick hash marks on that and writing quickly. But you can watch it on 1.5 or 1.75x speed. And in an hour and a half or 2 hours, you could get a thin slice of 20 keynote speeches. And from the companies that you respect the most, that are in the space, that have vocabulary words that are the most relevant to what it is that you're doing. And again, language, as I'm learning how to speak French, and we got the Pimsleur learning course for trying to learn how to speak French. You got a trip to Paris coming up end of the year. Language is a very verbal, working through liquid discipline. And so one of the things with personal growth is making sure that we stay up to date. If you're in finance, you're going to be looking at terms of AI and ChatGPT as it relates to finance. If you're in the mortgage industry, you're going to be looking at the rates and what the Fed is going to be doing and how policy is dictating that, or the cap that Congress is working through right now. Anything that's current, anything that has an appropriate vocabulary word, anything where there's principles and themes that run through the business that you're doing, I think relate to your audience, whatever business you're in.
What was that? What's that quote by Benjamin Franklin regarding marketing and the spiders over the doorpost or something like that?
Yeah, I think he said, if I was a spider looking to build a web, I'd surely build it in the corner, in the door jamb of the business owner who doesn't advertise.
And you have got to be current when you're advertising. You can't have an irrelevant message in your advertising game. So that definitely holds true. And I do totally agree with you as far as keeping it relevant, keeping it current. I know that some of the very best, like if you just from an orator standpoint, because I happen to, be a big fan of Billy Graham, Reverend Billy Graham, that he always said that he wouldn't necessarily read the newspaper, but he would look at all the headlines. He would be up to date. He would get information whenever he would travel to the cities that he was going to, what's currently going on, what's going on. And then he would not change the message necessarily before he would go and he would speak to millions of people, but he would definitely not be unaware because he wouldn't want to be offensive. It's like going to a different country and not knowing the local
2 or 3
customs.
hours a day.
Yeah, exactly.
Local newspapers, magazines, trade rags, anything that was current for that market.
Yeah, because he's he's acting almost as a dignitary or an ambassador when you go into a place, and you want to make sure that you know your surroundings. So, how do we see ourselves as a big key factor in our education, and then the books that we read, the things that we resource, the things that we draw from. You're a really busy person right now. We're putting hours into this podcast. You're putting hours into your job. You don't necessarily have time to sit down and put hours to reading. I know that you read for the work that you do for your job. How do you encourage people to, like, you notch out time to go to the gym? Would you consider that education is part of your mental gym? How do you look at the importance of a daily consumption of content personally, not just producing it, but actually consuming it? And then how do we filter, like, what's good content and what's bad content? Like, where does all that come together?
It has to do with, is your mind magnetized to win? And Napoleon Hill talks about in one of the books, he goes into detail about the propensity, which just means, it's a fancy word for saying a tendency to do something.
Mm-hmm.
That people who are definite in their aim, definite in their plan of action and their strategy to approach something, have a tendency or a propensity or a likelihood to divest themselves of anything that doesn't fit. In other words, if we were to go through all the reading material in this house, and we won't. We
I
only do
wish
that when
that
we move.
Andrew could show a B-roll or even just still images of the libraries, because
It's
I
hundreds
think
and
Madeline, our
hundreds
daughter,
and
has,
thousands.
I counted
Over
700
books
in her room.
in just Madeline's
in just
library.
her room.
And
So
she's only 20 and been reading,
yeah.
collecting books
we have that
10
ongoing
years, maybe.
joke of the heaviest thing that we move isn't
the biggest thing we
isn't
move.
our washer and dryer. It's
Yep.
the boxes of books
It's
that
the
we
boxes
cart
of books
around.
and magazines and
But it's funny
Architectural
because
Digest and
talk
Southern
about
Living and
husband and wife differences. Okay, guys, I'm gonna give you a little clue here. So my husband likes to buy every single book that he can get a hold of so that he can have access to it someday in the future. So lots of big library. I only like to put books on the bookshelf that
That look
I've
good.
read.
Oh, that
No,
you've read.
that I've
Yeah.
read, because I see it as a
wouldn't be any books on
completed,
the
it's
shelf.
like a trophy. It's like, I did that. And so when I see all of your books that I'm never going to be able to read ever, because there's like,
It's like a nervous
3,000,
tick.
I'm like, I'm never going to be able to consume all of this content.
6,000 books.
But you have a point. You want to be able to like act. You want like, if I have I mean, we've got books on like masonry. Like someday,
Yeah.
I might
With
build
all my
a
free
wall.
time, I'm going to build a wall.
I've got to build
out
a wall.
of brick.
Yeah,
By
Yeah.
myself. We don't pay anybody to do that. I'm even mixing that mortar up myself.
But you'll have a book on
But
it.
I'll have a book on it.
You'll
Time
have a
Life
book on
Books.
it.
Cancel anytime. Keep only the books you want. Or just keep all the books, which
Keep
is
all
what I
the
do.
books. That's funny. But so the libraries, the content,
Yeah, well, they're called reference libraries.
yours are reference libraries.
Yes, the city library is called a lending library. I don't lend books. I
My
buy them and
library
give them away.
is the library of books you done.
Yeah, hers is the done books.
Done books.
But yeah, they're considered, in the old days, they were considered a reference library. And I remember being freed up from this tension that I had of like, oh, I got to get all the books I can, especially when you start making a little money. You know, you got $200 or $500 of discretionary income in a whole month. And the books at Savers, which she doesn't let me buy anymore,
No,
are
you've got to get rid of one before you bring one in.
yeah. It's like laws. It's like Trump's administration with laws. Every time you get a new book, you have to get rid of 2 other books. But when you start getting to where you could buy 30, 40, 50, 60 books on a whim at $2 a piece, and you start filling, and your house just grows, there was tension to do that, because I thought, man, these are topics that I'd really like to study. I don't paint. Well, I do now. I paint now, but I didn't used to. But there are books that we have that I bought about famous painters, which I knew someday if I ever started painting, I would want to have as a reference for their lives and their philosophies, even though I had no time to study that when we were coming up. And to have those books, and then I was watching something, HGTV, maybe 10 years ago, and this guy talked about building a library with 300,000 books or something that was an extension of one of the university campuses. And he's like, you can use my extra warehouse,
My
for
personal.
my personal library. And he said it was about having access to the information when you needed it, not about reading everything in your library. Like with our house, we look at the square footage in our house and we say we want to use every square foot of our house. And we absolutely do. We're busting at the seams at the house that we're in right now, and have been here for several years, probably longer than maybe made sense from a physical footprint perspective, and not entirely because of the books that we have, for sure. But with a library, it's about having access to information that is interesting to you as your interests evolve, whether it's gardening or masonry or art. I've never painted anything in my life until maybe a year ago, and I did that one painting of the bushes that's hanging in the trailer. And then it becomes oil painting, and then it's portraiture, and then it's watercolors, and then there's canvases and sketchbooks and pencils and sharpeners and special erasers and white pencils in order to add accent lighting opposite the shadows. Like all of these things start to come out when you go down the rabbit hole of some area of interest. And I think that it's nice to have books on demand if you can afford them, to not only have on your shelves that look nice and create a great design aesthetic, but also that you can go to and say, for example, I'm reading a book on Monet right now in his early time, and there's some paintings in there of Monet's that I've never seen before, which are stunning. And they were in his early years, 20, 21 years old. He'd only really been painting for a couple of years professionally, and he still had not broken through in the traditional Parisian upper class, where most of the commissions came for the painters in the mid to late 1800s. But understanding these things and drilling down and really just being fascinated and engrossed in them, that helps to have a library.
Well, and it's part of, I think that since we're talking about education, I know a lot of people have come to us and a lot of people have asked us, why did we choose to unschool our kids or homeschool our kids, and the differences between having a traditional education. That's what I call anything. I'll just be clear. To be traditionally educated can either be public or private, but it consists of going to a class, sitting down, and getting the A through F grading system. That is what I consider traditional schooling. We have chosen to do non-traditional schooling, which is no grades, no necessarily having to do any particular curriculum, but it is very non-traditional because that's the way that you and I as adults, part of the conflict, part of the reason, honestly, why we chose to non-traditionally educate our children was it felt like hypocrisy having to live, choosing to live a very entrepreneurial lifestyle, being led and being going by our gut and really being able to immerse ourselves as adults into this entrepreneurial lifestyle, only to have our children have to go and sit down into desks and obey a system that we weren't particularly fond of for ourselves. And so deciding to make that decision to pull them out, deciding that we're going to work to learn and not work to earn, from a previous episode, you can learn more about that. But education creating within itself the desire to want more education. That's my whole, if I will consider myself a successful parent of non-traditionally educated children if by the time they become adults, their desire to continue to learn is the thing that they are the most excited about in life. Like they've learned that learning is just what it's what makes life go. It is and they're excited to learn. They want to go. I mean, Jeffrey, who's 25, he was just telling me about classes that he'd like to take just to continue to do ongoing education. Not for a degree, not for anything, not for status or bragging rights, but just because he loves to learn. And there's stuff out there. There's so much out there available to want to become. So how do you encourage people to shake off the in the box mindset for a out of the box level experience?
Well, first of all, I'll say that it's not our job to determine what anybody else does with their children or themselves as far as education, and we're not here to judge anybody or say what you should or shouldn't do. That said, education, from its root in the Greek, I think, Greek and Latin, means to pull out of somebody something that already exists inside of them, or to withdraw or to bring forth out of somebody. It doesn't mean to put something in, right? And so we don't need to be taught how to think or taught what to think. We need to be encouraged to think, to come to our own conclusions. And to think for ourselves is a very empowering position that I see a lot of administrations, a lot of propaganda, a lot of religious groups, some of them similar in name to the groups that we might subscribe to, getting engaged in telling people what to think, telling people how to think. And to me, it tends to push people into a position where they either reject it and they start thinking for themselves out of anger and wrath, which is not good for, the Bible says, don't bring your children to wrath, or they just do what they're told. And the congregation needs somebody to move to some other state that's not near their family. And they end up doing it because, okay, I don't mind learning how to speak another language and learn, going and living in a new town because I can accomplish a purpose for the congregation that needs it to grow. And you sit there and you're like, what do you want to do? Is that like, are you not thinking for yourself? Is that, what about that? What about your plans? What about your goals for your life? And the truth is, no matter what we say, no matter what anybody says or does, 2% of the people in the world are going to write down their goals and focus on them and look at them and persist against them and continue to go regardless of all of the adversities that come against them and actually work and work and work to a white hot fever pitch state of mind until they are able to overcome all of the adversities through consistency and persistency over time. Only 2% of the people are going to do that in the
And how
entire
do you
world.
motivate somebody to want to be ambitious?
I
Like,
think
how
the
do you
best way
motivate
can do it
ambition
is
into somebody?
go do something big with your life
Mm.
and bring other people with you. Create an opportunity for others to become a part of what it is that you're doing. Even this podcast, as silly as it might sound to the folks listening, the visitors, kind of like a visitor here in our podcast room at the house.
Welcome.
Welcome to the podcast room.
Welcome in.
Um, as the visitors and the viewers watch what we're talking about here, I can honestly say, without really any reservations at all, that this is the discussion that you and I have all day, every day for the last 27 years that we were married. We're not putting on a shining face for the camera. Now, my wife, thanks to a shout out from a buddy of mine with regard to attire and wardrobe, has helped me to upgrade my apparel for the purpose of filming. But the content is the same. These are the discussions. These are the topics that we have talked about all day, every day in our marriage for thousands and tens of thousands of days that we've been married, in the purpose of kind of creating a rhythm of pulling out of the other person their very best, having Jessica pull out of me the very best that I can bring to the table. And if we talk about homeschooling the kids, that was a super edgy topic of discussion from 2003 until about a week before COVID shut
Yeah.
the world down in 2020. So for 17 years, we were looked at as there's something wrong with you. Why aren't you like everybody else? Why aren't you just going along? Why, truancy officers and child protective services and all these
Potential challenges.
conflicts, along with, don't you know where all those kids came from? And get out of my way. What, you're walking down the street in the middle of the day with your kids and going to the mall. And
Are they all yours?
are those all yours? How many times have we gotten that question, right? And the truth is, it's just weird, right? It's different. It's not normal. It is peculiar compared to what most people do. But again, as a person who believes that I think for myself, as you think for yourself, we focused on outcomes in everything that we do. This podcast has an outcome, which is number one, create a permanent record for posterity, for our children, so that they could see what we were like in our prime and see the values that got us where we're going when we're still able to communicate it for as long as that we're here. That's purpose number one. Purpose number two, create a community with a back and forth discussion through this medium of podcast, YouTube videos, shorts, etc. That's the purpose behind the podcast. That's why we're doing this. When we have a purpose to the job, it needs to pay a certain amount of money. It needs to be in a certain vein where we can see success because of what we understand the marketplace to be needing. We live in the state that we wanted to live in the area in the state that we wanted to live in the town that we wanted to live in, that we've lived in for 17 years now. It's the longest town that we've ever lived anywhere, as far as I know. We're living in the house that we want to be in. And before we were in this house, because we hadn't found it yet, we were in the best house on the best street on the other side of this downtown area. And we've been constantly working toward getting ourselves in position to live the life we want to live in, the house we want to live in the town we want to live in, with the kids we want to have, with the cars that we want to drive, and the clothes that we want to wear, and the jobs that we want to do, and the books that we want to read, and the people that we want to associate with, and the trips that we want to take, and the content that we want to create. It's all been ferociously driven over time to be able to do these things. And so why would we leave the most important asset in our lives, which is our kids and our legacy? Why would we leave that to chance by putting them in an environment that doesn't have the same mandates for outcomes that everything else does? If you buy a car, you want an outcome. I want this car. I want to pay 40 grand or whatever. I want to have a loan at 3% or 7%. And I want to have this car for this period of time with this type of tires and these types of brakes. You have an outcome when you go to buy a car, and you're buying that car with cash. You have an outcome when you have a house. You when you're renting or buying a house, you want to live in this neighborhood, this kind of house, this many square feet, this many bathrooms. And for goodness sakes, we want it in good condition so we don't have to spend all of our extra income on plumbing and electrical upgrades. Well, why would we take the vacation that we spend time planning, the jobs that we have certain outcome expectations, the cars, the houses, all these things that are kind of flimsy and don't really matter that much, and yet in the area of child outcomes, like what's the outcome expectation from the schools that we have with our kids? Well, they're really good schools. Awesome. What's the outcome from
Right.
this really good school? What are we trying to get done? Well, they're going to get into a really good college. No, no, not if that's the only outcome is they're going to get into a really good college because of the school. Well, what's the outcome of college? Well, they're going to be able to get a really good job. Well, doing what? Right? And then where's the accountability from a truth and advertising perspective to say, if I'm going to take my time, if I'm going to take my money and put it into a house so I can get in a certain school district, so I can put my kids in a certain school so that they can get, what is the outcome from that? So again, we're not saying other people should do that. We're just saying that's our bias
Well,
is that we want
part of our
those
bias
outcomes identified.
and part of what we do is that we are very heavy on project based anything. That's why this is called the Jeff
Learning,
Heilman Project.
earning, all of
Project
it.
based learning, project based education, because and this is the key. This is the key caveat emptor. This is the key caveat is we do it because it builds intimacy. There's a difference between having quality time where you're just hanging out in the same space, in the same zone, side by side and watching TV. And then there's an level of intimacy, which is built between two people who are working on something, two or more people that are working on something together, working on a project together. People ask me all the time, how do you, how come your kids are so close? Like, I noticed that your kids are really close. Well, we've spent a lot of intimate time doing projects together. We won't just say, well, one person's good at that thing, so let's just leave them alone and let them go do it. No, we're going to all build a deck, or we're going to all go through the garage, or we're going to all go through the house, and we're going to
You guys
all
had
clean
game
the
night last
kitchen.
night.
We had game night last night because these are moments that build intimacy through building something together. And when you build something together, when you are actively building something and you're in a project, I mean, how many times do we see people go through a divorce, but it's after they've bought the house, moved, set up the house, they've done the project, and then when they're done with the project because they haven't set another goal or there isn't something else for them to work on, a lot of times people will end up unfortunately getting separated, getting divorced, or
Never thought
leaving.
about that.
There are
It's true.
projects that in
people-
the middle, those projects, building keeps people together. Building creates intimacy.
Yeah, Roosevelt, Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor said, "It's the work
That brings people
that
together.
brings people together. It's the doing of the work." And you do a lot of projects. I mean, you do yard work
Yeah.
as a project. You do dishes as a project. You do meals as a project. You do
We do our
remodeling,
homeschooling
and
as a
homeschooling
project.
as a project, book reading as a project, game night
Yeah.
as a project. This podcast is a project. I am the project that we're working on most of the time. That's why we call
Most
it
of
the
the
Jeff
time.
Heilman
project.
Project.
And guys, I'm super excited. I'm gonna do a little time out here. We do have a new project on the horizon. I'm not gonna give out too many details yet, but you're going to be able to reach out to us. You're going to be able to text us, Jeff, Jessica. You're going to be able to text us any of your questions.
Text your questions.
Any of your comments, if there's anything
your
that you want to
comments.
know, if you have any life
If you
situations
have
that you're
apparel
like,
advice.
if you have a like, hey, I'm starting a startup, like, what do you think? Text. You'll be able to text us, and so in the next few episodes, we're gonna put up the number at the bottom of the screen, and you're gonna be able to text in, and we'll respond to you. And then if you're okay to share it, if you're okay for us to share it, we will share it on the air, and we will talk about it.
We're not
So
going to name anybody unless
it's another
first names
project
maybe,
because
but-
I do love a good project. But again, it's the intimacy. When I have management over a household, which involves 9 persons, we've got to figure out what are we going to do to work together. What are we going to do? Because this is our first company. Your buddy Kevin calls it Jeff Inc. This is Heilman Academy. This is
That's
a
right.
Heilman Inc.
That's
And
right.
it's our first main project. And as a family project, what are we going to do? Where are we going? What is it going to look like 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And what is that completed project for each of these cases going to end up looking like and being. And so that's, if I can encourage anybody through this podcast, if we can encourage anybody through today's podcast on education and projects and ongoing things, would be to grow your intimacy together. Don't just try to go, do that house painting project all by yourself. Get the kids some brushes. Madeline laughs about it because her first job helping me paint was she was the girl with the rag. She had a little rag and she would go around and her job was to clean up the spills, and she hated it, but she was there. And now I have her do the painting and she's like, "Oh, so I've been promoted."
Been promoted
yes,
to
babe.
painter.
You've been promoted. You're
Official
not the little
cut-in-
rag girl anymore.
Cut-in brush painter. If we look at it's, if I'm going to make statements about saying, hey, why don't we just have outcome-based learning, just like we have outcome-based everything else that we do in our lives, it's really not anybody else's business what our outcomes are, but I have no problem sharing what the outcomes are that I want our kids to be able to. It's like, what's the framework, right? How do we start immersing our kids into the family culture of what we call high fives in the hallway, which is effectively, there are so many iterations of people walking past each other in a small house with 9 people. Jeffrey, not as much because he's out in DC now, but that we call high fives in the hallway, which just means, if dad's coming or if mom's coming, kids step to the side, right? Let the adults pass through, please. But the adults will always go through and pat them on the head, or, a noogie here, or
a high five,
some type of acknowledgement that says
that you are valuable,
you're part
and
of
you're
the
here.
team, you are loved, you are appreciated. I mean, I don't let my kids walk past. I'll go seek them out.
Oh my gosh, we have so many little by contact. So we have high fives in the hallway, which means you can't pass each other without giving each other a high five. Yeah. Then we have by contact.
By contact, which is eye contact when you're saying goodbye.
Yeah, eye contact when you're saying goodbye, because I just
that's funny.
By contact we started doing probably 10 years ago, because I remember listening to the radio, and I think it was K-Love or some Christian radio or something, and they were talking about how if unfortunately, like someday everybody's going to have their last, you're going to say goodbye to somebody for the last time. Unfortunately, either somebody's going to die or through age or whatever. And they said that how many times do we say goodbye and don't even look up from our phones, or don't even look out the window, or just like bye. And we're just so we created by contact. And so every time I would drop a kid off, I'd look out, the window would roll down, and I'd say, if they didn't look back at me and we made eye contact to say goodbye, they had to, I'd yell, "Bye contact," and then they'd turn around and they'd look at me and they'd say, "Bye mom, bye mom," and that was it.
Joe at diving.
It was Joe, because we were dropping him off for diving, because
right.
he was going to go do his sports. But bye contact, high fives in the hallway, constant, continual acknowledgement that not only are you a person, you are valuable to us, you are valuable in this symbiotic relationship that we have. I tell them all the time. I tell people who ask me, "How do you do it with 7 kids?" I tell them I learn more from them than I think that I could ever teach them, because I don't ever want to lose that posture of of humility, that my children are capable of teaching me just as much as I want to be a leader and be able to succeed and show them what picture of success looks like. They teach me something new every single day. Even little Nessie at 5 years old, she teaches me something every single day. And so that's a critical, important factor, is that, are we seeing our children as being valuable, and do they know how valuable they are to us and to you, to 100%. The people that are watching?
So we're getting into something here that's part of education, which is self-image. Mm-hmm. If there is one book that I could recommend to anybody in any walk of life, in any season of life, that unequivocally would add value to their life, and that could be in their library for a few dollars for the rest of their life, it would be the magnum opus self-image psychology book by Dr. Maxwell Maltz, called Psycho-Cybernetics. And don't be perturbed by the title. It's not Dianetics. That's something else. Psycho-Cybernetics just means the mechanics of how your self-image impacts. Psyche, who we see ourselves to be, self-image, and cybernetic, which is a mechanical rinse and repeat type motion or activity. And so it is the rinse and repeat motion or activity of our psychology, of our self image on our ability to do things. And it's changed so many aspects of how we live as a family. And one of the things that it talks about in there is that the human being cannot act differently than they see themselves and their environment to be. You cannot. In other words, and it tells a story of if you were to be walking through Yellowstone, I almost said Jellystone National Park, walking through Yellowstone National Park, and if you saw a bear, you would have a
Yogi Bear?
fight or flight. If you saw a Yogi Bear, that would be a different response. You'd probably wonder, maybe what you were on that day. But if you saw a regular grizzly bear, you would have a fight or flight response. A grizzly bear might see you, might not see you, depending on if you're standing upwind or not. But if you saw a bear, your palms would start to sweat, your heart rate would increase, your breathing would increase, all the blood would go to your legs and arms so that you could get ready to run. I mean, it's a fight or flight response. And it's perfectly normal. It's a survival instinct. And yet, if we were to see a person standing in a bear costume who looked like a bear and sounded like a bear and was big like a bear, and we thought it was a bear, we would have exactly the same response to seeing a bear, even though it's not really a bear. And that conditioned response of how we're going to act in a given set of circumstances can be translated to a whole bunch of different things: being yelled at by your manager, being laid off, being fired, going through financial problems, going through health problems.
Or even wins, having
or
lots
wins.
of money in the bank all of a sudden.
Yeah,
and
lots
not
of money.
knowing
I
what
mean,
to do
we
with
went
it.
through a shocking experience with the sale of a company in late 2004, and it took me a couple of years to get over making hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single paycheck. And I'd never had that. I mean, we'd been living with $50 left over for 10 years. And then all of a sudden I've got a couple $100,000 in my checking account in a single day. It is shocking. And your nervous system takes a while to adjust to that, just like it would if you'd lost a couple $100,000, which we've also had the loss of a company where, it's close to 7 figures that was just gone in a day. And that was also shocking and took time for the nervous system. And so what we see, what's my point in all this? The point is that we can't act differently than we see our environment to be. Cannot. And so if we see everybody's out to get me, things are always going wrong, COVID never ends, all the bad things are happening, this administration or that administration, right? Whatever administration it is, it's amazing to me that I've heard people talking about how horrible the current administration is, quote unquote, the current administration is, in every single administration that we've had since I started keeping track. So it's all a matter of function of belief and understanding. And if you can't act differently than you see your environment to be, what if you changed what you thought about the environment so that you could act in congruency with that? That's what Psycho-Cybernetics is about. It's on Audible. It's in paperback. You can probably find it at I know you can find it. It's in print. You can find it in Barnes & Noble, multiple editions. But you can also find it used at Goodwill and Savers for $2. That's the best $2 I would ever have spent in my life, and the time and energy.
I love how he talks about from the standpoint of a doctor, and he talks about how, if he would mend somebody as a plastic surgeon, if he would heal somebody's little itty bitty scar, they might go out and drop 300 pounds and become like the best, this person that they've, the most valuable player on their team. They become this superstar, but then he'll do entire reconstructive surgery on a burn victim who looks absolutely stunning, and they can't get out of their own house because they still have that same. And so he asked himself while he was writing that book,
is it really the outside
what's
that changes
going
people?
on? Yeah,
that was his question.
Right.
And he goes from a plastic surgeon, a certified, licensed plastic surgeon who'd been in practice for 25 years, in his mid-50s, and he comes to this conclusion based on exactly what you just said. 2 use cases, 2 people who were both treated and had a 6-month follow-up at about the same cadence. And one was a woman who, she had a tiny mole, probably half the size of the one that's on my face, removed from her face, and that was it. And 6 months later, she'd lost 30 pounds, gotten married, gotten pregnant with her first baby, bought a house, and started her first company, which was now financially viable and successful, all in a 6-month period following a simple 5-minute outpatient procedure to remove a mole that in her mind made her feel ugly and less than. Contrary to that, there was a burn victim who had 7 or 8 surgeries over a 6-month period of time, who his family was crying and shocked and just joyful that they had their family member back, and he wanted his money back feeling like there was no change whatsoever. And he's like, I'm showing you the before and after photos. And his response was, I know, but I don't feel any different. So he was finding fault with the surgery. And he's scratching his head going, there's got to be something to this experience between these two patients. What is it? And it is that concept of narrative, of tweaking how we look at things and how we view ourselves and our environment to be. So for our kids, really there's five outcomes. If we see ourselves as winners and we judge ourselves by outcomes that we're getting, then we're going to judge ourselves by outcomes in anything that we're doing, children's education included. And this is much about adult education as it is children, but we effectively want 5 things as outcomes for our kids. Number 1, mental toughness. We want them to be able to understand and handle the ups and downs of life without losing their cookies over it. And we start them out when they're real little. And as they get older, they realize that it is inappropriate for them in this family to act compromised in their emotions because of little things that happen in their life.
And let's be clear that
Little
emotions are
relative.
good. We are pro emotions. We are not emotion stuffers. But we encourage our children to not make any important decisions, to not make any type of communications until you can consider yourself emotionally stable. Because when you are out of control, that's when cars get crashed. That's when people get hurt. That's when things happen. So emotions are okay. And I always tell them, you can go cry. Just go cry in your room. Go cry in your room.
Yeah.
Come back out when you feel better. We're okay.
If
You
you're
can
gonna
have
be
these emotions.
compromised,
If you're going to be
gonna
compromised,
cut out of the herd
you
temporarily.
need to go take a minute
Yeah.
for yourself, collect yourself, and then come back
Exactly
and
right.
join the team.
And what we found is that, Jessica and I, we go through periods where we're compromising stuff and are raising our voice and yelling about things that are important to us at the time. But we don't do it in public. We don't do it on camera. We don't do it in front of the kids if we can help it. We work through those things and we give ourselves the time that we need to settle down about something. Then we come back and we try to set that example. Are we perfect about it? No. But we do maintain the outcome that we're after of mental toughness is number 1, the most important life skill we could have for children is to understand when they're emotionally compromised and how to, if they fall off the wagon, how to get back on it. Number 2 is basic double entry accounting, right? Just simple math for how to count and keep track of money, interest rates, return on investment, etc. Are all of our kids great at math? Not all of our kids are not all great at math, but if they understand basic accounting, can balance a checkbook, and they know how to handle looking at investment schedules, then by the time they're 30, these are outcomes that we're hoping for by the time
They
they're
might not be
30.
fluent, but they can speak the language.
If they can speak the language, exactly. Number 3 outcome is teamwork, how to work together as a team, all pulling direction and effectively scale through labor as the project lead. Problem solving, persistence and consistency over time to be able to stick at something like building a large Lego structure, for example, could be an example of mental toughness, of teamwork, and a problem solving all together. Basic accounting, and then so teamwork, problem solving, basic accounting, mental toughness training, and then communication skills, right? Can you read for understanding? Can you speak for understanding? Are you able to present yourself well? Can you write? Can you type? Can you text? Do you understand the flow and cadence of business communication to where we're not texting our kids and then we never hear back, right? Those 5 outcomes, we have put a stake in the ground and said, these are the things that we want our kids to learn by the time they're 30. And if they do that, we'll feel like we've done our part as parents to create the
I
environment
think
that
that,
helps them.
at least for this point, it's important because we're verbalizing it so that everybody else that's listening can hear kind of our points of view and things like that. We know, because there's so much that goes unsaid, that what we're also unsaying is that having a relationship with God is not one of those 5, because we believe
It's
that
not
it
an
is a
outcome.
personal relationship, and it is our desire as we profess our faith and as we live living examples of our faith, that we shouldn't have to, we do not ever want to impress it upon our children to make religion or having some faithful practice have to become a religion in their life, or have to become not just another number, another 1 through 5, another number. It's always been our desire, if they practice, that it is a choice to practice personally for themselves and in faith, that it is a choice and it is a decision that they will each make on their own. So I just know that these 5 things are the most important things as far as a tactical, what are we going to do to get
outcomes.
through life
Yeah.
and create an outcome.
Skills you need
Having
to
a
survive.
relationship with God, being faithful, that's not an outcome. That's a lifestyle.
That's not an
That is how you live, how you choose to live. And so I think that we're getting kind of close to our hour being up. There's so much more that we could talk about. We could talk about that's why we're doing a podcast, is for days and days and days. We could talk about making messes. We could talk about being a big hitter versus like being super ultra conservative. We could talk about cash is trash. I mean, there's just so much that we could talk about, but today's focus being going full circle. The whole reason why I started out this podcast was saying, hey, what's the worst that you've ever witnessed when it comes to education or comes to Keynote or something?
I'll tell you one of the best.
I was going to say, because we won't know our bests
Yeah.
if we have never been exposed to our worst, and it's through all of this content and fielding it out that we're able to produce this product. So
Yeah.
what is what would you say?
Well, I would say anything by Tony Robbins is going to be is
Up there?
great. I mean, it's just exceptional quality. But specifically, he did one on Soshiro Honda and how Honda persevered. That was about a 10-minute one. He also does one on Rocky Balboa.
Oh my gosh.
Which was
the best.
just incredible. There was a talk given called The Strangest Secret by Earl Nightingale, who was one of only 2 survivors from the bombing of the USS Arizona in 1942. 42, the day of infamy, and I don't remember when it is. But The Strangest Secret, you can get that on YouTube by Earl Nightingale, stands pretty clearly in the white brilliance of the ether as a top level discussion. Harold Sherman and Claude Bristol.
Rich DeVos, Selling America.
Oh, Rich DeVos. If you haven't heard Rich DeVos,
Isn't that in the
Selling
Library
America,
of Congress?
Oh my God, I want to cry. Yeah, Gerald Ford, president of the United States at the time, committed Selling America to the Library of Congress due to cultural significance of its time by Rich DeVos when he was giving a keynote speech to the Young Future Business Leaders of America crowd in Toronto, I think.
Yeah,
he was
Canada.
in Canada. And fellow Americans, fellow Canadians,
I mean, we've
our
got
friends to the north.
You've got Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech.
Sure.
You've got the Gettysburg Address. If you just want to go back and like read some of these are pivotal moments in time where we can take our future and where we're going by studying the past and bringing forward through education
And it's
principles.
a sound. Language, success is a language. It's a sound. One of the strangest things that I've seen is that when I meet somebody who is very successful and very well read, and I meet them for the first time, we almost always get into a rhythm of dialogue about principles and things that have been bedrocks for us in our psyche, in our beliefs, in our narratives, which have allowed us to achieve and perform at a really high level for a long time. And I've met people who have made orders of magnitude more money than me. They've had huge public companies that they've run, but I consider
you can
myself
still sing the
I
song.
can still sing the songs. I know the words to the songs.
That's
I
right.
know what it sounds like, and it's shocking to me to see that it's almost like if you've ever been to another country and you hear a member of the expat community or another person from your country
in the same accent.
with the same language, you can hear it instantly, that you recognize it and makes you feel like home. And what I found is that successful people have language skills of success and success philosophy of that same values-based narrative. And that if you can learn through listening to successful people, and I'm not saying you could turn this podcast off right now and go listen to Earl Nightingale. You're probably better off listening to him. He has more lists, he has more followers, right? More people know him. But if you can listen to the way that successful people speak and just drill it into your mind, you'll become fluent in the language of successful people, and you'll be amazed at how the people that come into your life and stick in your life will continue to be people that do better and better over time.
Well, if you strip a person like Grant Cardone of his billions,
Oh,
he's still going to have the
so great.
mindset of a billionaire, because
That's
a
right.
billionaire's mindset isn't based on the amount of money that you
Yeah.
have in the bank. It's a set mind on
It's a set
certain
mind.
principles.
That's right.
And so we just want to encourage you today and those that are listening to set your mind to where it is that you're going, where you want to go, and understand
And
that
keep it there.
Keep it there as long as you possibly can. Encourage ongoing education, desire, learn, get that love of learning, of wanting. And it might not be, you might think, well, I need to learn accounting. And if that doesn't like get you excited, then you don't need to learn accounting. You can pay for somebody
you can pay
else
somebody
to do accounting later.
But at least you need
What-
to know that it needs to be done.
Right. What gets you
You're gonna make any money.
excited? What lights that fire in you that you want to learn about it? Jeff really wanted to learn about oil painting. He really wanted to learn about playing guitar. Like, these are things that you couldn't go to sleep at night without first wanting to learn these things. Those are the
And
passions.
it's
Those are the
pulling
embers
out of
that we're
us
looking
those
for
things
you.
that we want to become. If you
Yeah.
think about where you're going to be when you're 50, 60, 70, 80, I see myself as a guitar player on the beach who paints during the day and sings songs at night. And that image of being able to pull those skills out of my dormant, untapped potential is motivating enough for me to put myself in position to have books and tapes and seminars and podcasts and keynote speeches and note taking and journaling and meditation and paid courses on Udemy and all these other platforms. There's so much out there that can help facilitate us becoming the people that we want to be. You're not going to get there without definiteness and focus and purpose and planning and structure, but that's why we've put faith and health and order and work before the education part of it. Now we're getting to the good stuff.
That's right. And you won't want to miss it. So don't forget to tune in next week for another exciting episode. You can watch the videos on Tuesdays and hear new audio episodes on
Friday morning.
Fridays. And thanks for tuning in. We'll be looking forward to giving you more information on how you can text us at the Jeff Heilman Project so we can continue the conversation with you. Have an awesome and blessed rest of your day wherever you may be at. And thank you for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in.